So let's start from the very beginning with your engagement with China. Started back with the Peace Corps in the late 1990s. You were stationed to Fuling, and you decided to return to Sichuan in 2019, this time with your wife, Leslie Chang, and your twin daughters to teach at Sichuan University. Can you talk to us a little bit about that decision and the circumstances that led you to a teaching job?
Yeah, I mean, I was, as you mentioned, I was in the Peace Corps 96 to 98 in a small city called Fuling, which at that time was in Sichuan. Now it's in Chongqing. And that was a great experience and, really fascinating moment. Most of the students were coming from the countryside. Economic development had just started to happen in small cities like Fuling. And that was the subject of my first book, Rivertown. And after publishing that book in 2001, I stayed in very close contact with the people I had taught, with actually more than 100 of my former students. So, some of those years I was living in China and I would go and visit them, but the correspondence was mostly by letter and then eventually by email. So I had this, intense contact with this group of people over, a long period of time. And I always had the idea that it would be interesting to go back to that region and to sort of see how their lives had changed, how the town of Fuling had changed. And I thought that a good way to do it would be to be a teacher again. And I sort of settled on this idea of returning after a period of about 20 years, because that's basically kind of like a generation.
Got it. Now, you make stark comparisons between the students you taught back in the 1990s. You call them the reform generation, and the students you've encountered just a few years ago. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, the differences are enormous. I mean, first of all, I was teaching at different types of universities. So back in the 90s, I taught at what was called a teacher's college, in Chinese, a 专科学校. So it was a 3-year college. It's sort of like a junior college. And when I went back in 2019, I was teaching at Sichuan University, which is what the Chinese would call a 985 university. It's the designation they give to the top 40 or so universities in the country. So it was a higher level place. But really, in the 1990s, it was so unusual to go to college for anybody. It was only about 8% of Chinese college age citizens went to pass high school at that time. That even those students were pretty unusual academically to get into a place like Fuling. At that time, almost everybody in my classroom had grown up in the countryside, which was true of Chinese population as a whole. It was like more than 80% rural for their generation. And they generally, had lived in pretty marginal economic circumstances, and some of them had been quite poor. And quite a few of them had parents who couldn't read. That was really common. Very few of their parents had much education at all. And usually they were the first or second kids from their villages to go to college. So that was a, very specific moment in China's development. And they were trying to expand the university system. By the time I returned in 2019, that rate of attending college had risen from 8% in 1996 to more than 51%. So more than half of young Chinese now enter college, and that kind of expansion is really hard to grasp. I mean, I don't think there's ever been a society that has been able to expand the education system and college entrance, at such a rate. So that was a huge difference. The students, my first semester when I taught 3 classes at Sichuan University, and I didn't have one student who had come from the countryside. They were all urban kids. More than 90% of them were only children, because of the one-child policy. Whereas in the 90s, most of these kids came from big families. They usually had 3 or 4 siblings. And when I taught at Sichuan University, the kids were basically middle class or even higher. It was unusual to have somebody who was coming out of poverty. So those changes, and they kind of reflected some of the changes that had happened across China as a whole.
You also said the students today are taller, they have more money, they own Air Jordans. One of them had a $150,000 car. Well, that was your previous student from the past.
Yeah, no, I talk about. I mean, in the '90s, the kids, you would sort of memorize the kids' names in the beginning by their clothes, actually, because they wore the same thing every day, basically. Because they didn't have much. They had to wash everything they owned by hand, in cold water, and so they just wore the same clothes every day. And you kind of would associate certain kids with certain outfits. And some of the kids wore those Chicago Bulls knockoff jerseys, like very cheap little jerseys that were sold on the street in Sichuan at that time. And I was really struck when I went to, back to teach in 2019. I mean, one of the kids had on these like kind of throwback Air Jordans, and I asked them how much they'd cost, and they were $450. You know, it was the kind of money that would have been inconceivable back in the old days. Yeah, so and the height was a huge difference. I mean, I would show the kids at Sichuan University a picture of me standing with my students in Fuling from 1996, and they always laughed because I looked so tall. Like I was just way taller than all of those students in Fuling, and I was only 5'9". Um, but people were short then because of nutrition. You know, the Lancet ran an article in 2021, a study that showed that out of 200 countries, China had had the largest increase in boys' height and the third largest increase in girls' height, since 1985. So this is, just because of improved living standards, because of improved nutrition. The average 19-year-old boy in China is now 3.5 inches taller than when I taught in the 90s. So yeah, so differences like that. I mean, they're really visceral. You feel them at the physical level, and it gives you sort of a different understanding of what poverty is and what it means to escape poverty.
What about the differences in ideology or perhaps the way that they see the world? I sensed maybe a slightly more pessimistic, I mean, maybe not slight, but just more pessimistic view of the awareness that they had about their political circumstances. And, you don't address that head on, but could you talk, a little bit about that? And perhaps you could tell it through the story of Serena or one of the other characters in the book.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the differences, when we taught in the 90s, they often seemed very young. The students, they almost seem like children to many. And there's a section in Rivertown where I described that, that it was easy to get sort of to fool yourself into thinking that they were children because they seem very naive in many ways. And really, of course, they had been through some very intense things to get to where they were, and often they had known real poverty and real difficulty in their family situation. So I always had to kind of push against that instinct, but it was the way they felt. They felt like very young because they were entering this new world. They had come out of the countryside and now they're in the city. They're trying to learn how to become educated people, how to become city people. The world was sort of brand new to them. The kids at Sichuan University, in this book, I described them as old souls. They felt older than their years in many ways. And by that, I mean that they had a very, they had grown up in the city. They had grown up in the system. They would often talk about ne, the job, when you're in the system. That's a Chinese phrase. Like if you have a job that's in the government system, they're very savvy about how the system worked. Their parents, for example, gave them a lot of insights and guidance into how to negotiate the system, which was another big difference from the generation I taught in Fuling. With those kids, they often wrote, and in years later, when when we would correspond about things, they often said, my parents were not able to give me any advice at all. They were just farmers. They didn't understand how the modern world works. One of them wrote on a survey, they raised us like they raised pigs and chickens. They did not give us much love. So that was a very specific generation, but this new generation was raised differently. And one of the things that you learn in China is how to deal with the system, how to get along. You recognize the flaws in it, the things that are wrong, but you just try to avoid it. Your goal is not necessarily to change it. And I think that's a lesson that many of these young people learned early. They also sort of impressed me as being quite risk averse. That generation in the 90s, they had nothing to lose. They were thrown into this new world and they went out and they found their way, and they were really tough, very determined, and they took big risks. And some of the ones that I knew who became entrepreneurs made fortunes, by taking risks. And it's not really that climate anymore, and the young people today know it, and they know that they have to be a little cautious. They have to be careful what they do. They're still very tough, I think, in that there's a lot of pressure on them, but there isn't the same appetite and opportunity for risk as there was in the 90s.
There's more to lose, perhaps.
Yeah, they have a lot to lose. I mean, they're first of all, they're already in the middle class, pretty much all of them. They're not really sure. When I did surveys, most of them would say that they expected their lives to be better than their parents. So they still would say that in surveys, but there was more uncertainty about that, and I felt like there is some sense that maybe that's going to change. Um, and they're only children. That's a very different relationship. When you're the only kid and your parents, all these parents have invested a lot in their education of the children, And the kids feel that. They feel that pressure. And they feel that responsibility. They're not going to throw it away. They're not going to take a couple years off and wander the world. They feel like they have to, they have to find a way to succeed.
So part of the narrative of the book is your twin daughter's experience at a public elementary school. And, Natasha and Ariel knew little Mandarin on the first day. They spent 2 years there. Can you tell us about, what you were surprised by with their experience there? And then I'll ask some questions about the girls.
Yeah, I mean, I think actually I was surprised. I was surprised in some ways that the school let them in, because they were at a, prominent Chengdu primary school that had not had foreign students in the past. And we went there a year ahead of time to kind of meet with people there, and I had a friend who was sort of talking with the school, and we spent a lot of time on it. But in the end, I mean, I am a writer, and my wife is as well, and we're foreigners and we're Americans, and this was a time when relations between China and America could not be much worse. And but they let them in, and I was sort of impressed by that. And then of course the pandemic happened and the trade war intensified and American journalists were kicked. I mean, just a really awful series of events. And the school was very good about protecting my daughters from fallout related to these things. When other kids started to make anti-American comments, the school very quickly put an end to it. There was never any talk about, hey, we're sorry under this situation with the pandemic, we can't have foreigners in the school anymore, which I kind of expected them to do in some ways. So I was impressed at that. There was a kind of openness there that generally was not characteristic of this moment in China.
Well, you pepper the text with math problems, with math word problems, and I kept reminding myself that this was third grade. And you write sometimes that you and Leslie were often overwhelmed in part with the language learning, trying to get them up to speed, and then also the homework. Did you come away thinking it's too much, or did you come away thinking, wow, why aren't we doing this, in the US? I mean, this is maybe why we're lagging in STEM
Yeah,
subjects.
I mean, we were overwhelmed, partly because, I mean, I was teaching again for the first time after more than 20 years. It's always hard to kind of start something like that. And we were moving to a new city. And then we also had to kind of manage our girls' transition to the school, and they didn't have the language. So when they were doing their math homework, we had to kind of translate all these incredible word problems for them, which is my wife's Chinese is better than mine, but neither of us knows this stuff well enough to just sit down there. We'd have to have dictionaries and we would be trying to figure out, and they're hard math problems, right? And it is, as you say, it's incredibly demanding. I mean, they usually would have 3 to 4 hours of homework a night. I mean, those third graders, when they had their final exams at the end of semester for math, it was, I think it was 100 minutes for math, 90 minutes for language, 90 minutes for English, 90 minutes for, I mean, you're talking about having kids who are third graders sitting down for an hour and a half exam, right? I mean, they're the attention, you could just see like they're kind of training them to focus, to be able to in the book I mentioned it's like endurance athletes. I'm a distance runner, and I've coached, and I can see this is kind of like coaching endurance runners. I mean, they're teaching these kids in preparation for the exam. There in some ways there are things that I really admired about it, and some things that my daughters liked was that once it was established, once they got the language down and they were in the sort of in the flow of things, they were good students and they were respected for being good students, and the other kids gave them status because of that. You became more popular. In a Chinese school, you were more popular if you're a good student. When they came back to Colorado, the fact that they're good students is going to be a negative, right? I mean, this is sort of, I think that's not true in all places, but in your average American public school, which is kind of, we're just in a small community here, and the kind of school I went to in Missouri, the public school I went to in Missouri, it's generally like that. If you're a good student, that's not good for your social standing. And so my daughters come here and they really felt like they had to kind of excel at sports or something in order to have any kind of, social standing. And things like that are a little depressing. I mean, I do think, and I think Leslie and I were both kind of in agreement in that there are, something between what they have in China and what they have in the United States would kind of be what we would like for an education system for the sure. The Chinese system is remarkable and the value in education is really incredible. I really like the way they treat teachers, basically. I mean, and that teachers have standing. They're paid pretty well. Of the people I taught in Fuling who became teachers, almost all of them stayed in the profession, which would not be true for an American cohort, over a 25-year span. So I like that aspect of it, but it's a little too much, and there's too much, pressure on the kids, too much homework, not enough free time. And on the American side, I value things like they do pay more attention to the kids' sort of, mental health or their mental, you know, state of being. The schools are attentive to that, and I've found that when I've been back here at a public school, like they care about that. They're better at understanding that than Chinese schools are, and they let kids be more active. There's more sort of free-ranging things, but in some ways, it's too easy academically. At many American schools, and so I would like to see some combination of these things.
I'd be curious to know, after 2 years, were they perfect? Were they speaking at a native level in Mandarin? Were they reading and writing?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. No, they were doing everything the other kids did, and they would score quite well on the UN, the language, class and everything. And I mean, they're still doing it. They still write essays in Chinese by hand. They're still following the Chinese curriculum for UN for language, with their tutor in Chengdu. Yeah.
Wow, and how many hours a week is that?
They don't, so they going slower than they would go in China, of course, but they usually, we try to have 2 tutorials a week, basically. It's worked because they're like, I don't think it works if you're just pushing the kid to do it, but they like it and they care about it. Like they value. I mean, just recently I was in New York with Natasha, and I went to a dinner with a lot of Chinese people, and it was the whole evening was in Chinese, and she was just completely comfortable with that kind of an environment, and it's just very natural. And so it was an amazing way for them to learn Chinese. We're very glad that we did it, and we're glad that we had at least 2 years because that was a good amount of time for them.
All right, now back to the book. We have to talk about COVID. You write about the fact that while the world was shutting down and isolating, and China schools were open, cafes were packed, and you really appreciated having that time. Tell us about that time.
Yeah, I mean, it's a hard thing to describe to people because most countries sort of had the same COVID track throughout. Like if a country did it well, they usually did it well throughout. Or if they did it badly, they did it badly from start to finish, more or less. And China was really unusual because, of course, at the beginning they had a big cover up in Wuhan, and things spiraled out of control, and just they made all kinds of mistakes, and it was a disaster. But then there was a second phase that started kind of in February of 2020 and lasted for a long period where they handled it quite well. The policies they had were basically, I think, appropriate to the virus, and very similar to what was done in like Taiwan and Japan and South Korea and other places in Asia that tended to handle this pretty well. So most of that year, for example, my kids were back in the classroom in the spring of 2020. I was flying for research by April of 2020. The first time that we went to a restaurant was March 8th. By March 8th, it was done. The virus was done in our city of Chengdu. We were going back to restaurants. There were no more cases. The last case was February 20th. And so that's basically when it was just starting to happen in the US. We were already finished. And it didn't come back until basically Omicron in 2022, which is when we had left, and end of 2021. And at that point, then China botched it again, because they kept their zero COVID policy way too long. After the new variants had appeared, after the vaccines had appeared, they didn't adjust. And so then they had this awful period of lockdowns that we read about here in the US. We were fortunate that we didn't experience that. But I think the thing that's really striking about China is you have these kind of three distinct phases in which they had very different outcomes. And each of those phases tells us something really different about strengths or weaknesses of the Chinese system.
Now, the circumstances that led you to leave China, tell us a little bit about that. I thought that was striking.
Yeah, I mean, this was, I was there on a 1-year contract. And after the first year I renewed, and, I enjoyed the teaching a lot. The kids, couldn't have been better, I felt. I never had any complaints about the students I was teaching. And the school, I think, was also happy. I had good reviews from the students, and I had a teaching award at the end of my first year. And so then we were finishing the second year, and Leslie and I had no desire to go back to the States. We felt like we wanted to continue. And so I offered to renew my contract or to stay on with the institute I was at, which was connected to the University of Pittsburgh, sort of a joint program between the University of Pittsburgh and Sichuan University. and the dean, who was an American citizen, told me that they couldn't renew it. And basically, his reasons were sort of, he kind of gave different reasons at different times. He was somewhat evasive. There was also there was no personal communication. He never called. It just seemed like he was just trying not to confront this. And I later heard from a couple of different sources at the university that, that my writing was one of the reasons. I'd been publishing stories in the New Yorker, and it made people at the university nervous. And actually, what I was told was that when I wrote articles and there were attacks on Chinese social media, the university had to write reports about this, and they were kind of annoyed at doing these reports. So a lot of it was just a bureaucratic thing, like, just, this is a hassle. Let's just get rid of this guy. So, it wasn't a shock to me, but it was a disappointment because you know, I felt like I was doing good work there, and I don't actually think the risk to the university was very high.
So your story, you've spent almost 30 years writing about many things, but in part about Chinese people themselves. What do you think about the next generation of China watchers? I mean, there are so few Americans studying in China now. The Chinese feel hesitant about coming to the US to study. Those numbers are a little bit down. If, we believe in people to people relations as a very important part of US China relations, where is all of that headed?
Yeah, I mean, there still are a lot of Chinese here, right? I mean, it's almost 300,000 still. So they've continued. I have a ton of former students that are here and other places. They're in even in Africa, right? I mean, so they're still going out, but we are not, right? So it's become very one-sided. And I would say this is definitely a crisis, in that I worry that we're losing another generation of China watchers and people that go to China. And you can't do, it's like what your husband Rob did as well. And what I did, what we did in the 90s is you just sort of showed up there and you learned what you could, and you found a way to try to explain this place to the outside world. And it was really, there was so much energy around the journalist community in the late 90s or early 2000s. And there were a lot of good books that came out of that era. And that's not happening now. It's really hard for a young person to go there. It's hard politically, and it's hard in terms of getting visas in China. Um, but we've also cut off some of our institutions that did this, right? Like the Peace Corps, the program that sent your husband Rob, that sent me and many others to China. That was ended by the Trump administration in early 2020. The Fulbright program is not sending people to China anymore. I mean, these are big mistakes. And so there needs to be more institutional support to encourage young people to go over there. But I mean, that's one of the reasons why I've, trying to support my daughter studying Chinese, because I think, this is, useful. This is something that more people in America should be doing. And to be frank, I think there's opportunity in it, right? I mean, when there's a time when very few people are doing this, that's when you should think about doing it. You're going to stand out.
Well, near term, does that say about the quality of the information that's coming out of China, or the quality of the information upon which, our government officials are making decisions? And
Yeah, I mean, the good thing is that you do have a lot of people that are still working really hard to do whatever they can, even though they're far away. And you do have a lot of information on social media, and people have built up contacts over time, and they're doing what they can with that, right? And so you can follow a lot of things that way. And there's all kinds of sort of exiled China experts who are working on this. But there are limitations, and the people who are doing that work diligently, they would be the first to tell you that it's not perfect. One problem is I think it skews a little toward the elite, when you're looking at it from afar. I mean, that's the advantage, especially of living in a place like Chengdu and going to a place like Fuling, is these are not, the most elite parts of the country, and you're going to get a better sense of how average people feel. And I think we've always had trouble getting that perspective, and I think now it's even worse because we have fewer people on the ground. Um, you also you lose the texture of daily life, and along with that, you kind of lose the ability to humanize the place, right? And the more abstract that China becomes and the more distant that it becomes, the more terrifying it is in a lot of ways, or the more negative it is. I mean, when I was there during this pretty difficult time, um, and certainly some sides of the experience were hard, but my feelings were still very positive on the personal level. Like, I really admired my students and I enjoyed spending time with them. When I went back to Fuling and visited my former students and other people I'd known since the 1990s, that was great. And I also was sort of struck by all of them. I felt like had become more aware and better informed. Like I didn't meet anybody that I would say, yeah, that guy's really gone crazy. He's got just some weird ideas, like, whereas if you look at Americans, like if I went back and talk to people I went to high school with, in the 80s or something, and some of them would have ideas now that I would think are not, they haven't gone in the right direction, right? I mean, they haven't become more educated. I couldn't really think of anybody in China that I would put in that category, so that's a good, like, on a personal level, that feels very good, right? But at the institutional level, you're looking at this country that's pretty, that's become very repressive, right? The political climate is very dark. So communicating this to people is really hard, and you have to be there on the ground. You have to be able to spend time with people in order to do that.
It struck me that, our last year's reporting in China, 2018, 2019, I'm talking about myself, people were not engaging with me anymore as a journalist. They were scared to. And now, obviously, there's this sort of nationalistic sentiment, and we shouldn't be, Chinese shouldn't be engaging with foreigners. There's a fear that you write about in your book. Does that go away when the political climate changes, or does it take some time? Like, are we talking about now a generation that's going to be growing up under this climate, and it's not something that you can just turn off like that, you know?
I think they can in a way. I mean, I think people there are pretty flexible. They learn to sort of adjust to the political climate, and they're so much better educated than they used to be. So I think if you open up some space, they'll fill it. They will definitely. And there are lots of people. I mean, I hear from them every day. Man, I get these long letters from readers in China, and they're saying, I thank you for recording this. I wish I could. I really want to. Right. I mean, so I think people do, they want something different, and they would respond if they were given the chance.
Now, you write about the students, this time around, they were headed off to Lubbock, Munich,
Mhm.
Singapore, London. Materially, they're better off. But did you ever think about what about in other ways, like spiritually, health and happiness? In some ways, they are migrants. I mean, every generation has been a migrant generation in some way, but these new students are heading off to faraway places, gaining new knowledge, and they'll be making the decision whether to stay or come back. Are they better off? What do you think about some of these things?
Yeah, I think they're better off. I generally feel optimistic about them. Like first of all, because I think they're incredibly skilled and talented and dedicated, and they have all of the abilities that you need in this world. But also, they're thinking this stuff through. When I meet with them, they're having long conversations. What do I want out of life? What do I want from the future? They don't feel like automatons, or even though the school system has this incredible pressure, and it is not producing cookie cutter individuals, really. I mean, these people are thinking, they're trying to figure out their path, and when I meet with them, it's an uplifting experience. I mean, I feel for them because they're under, they're wrestling with difficult things, and in some ways I think it's harder than it was in the 90s, because the 90s, those kids, everything was straightforward, right? So you want to go to the city, you want to become educated, you want to make some money and not be poor anymore. And they were all very straightforward goals, and they were all actually achievable. And many people in China from that generation achieved them, and almost all the people I taught did. But nowadays, like, what's the goal? You got to figure that out, right? So it's more complicated. It's not as existential. Like, it's not like you go back to the village and you're eating once a day or something, like some of these kids would describe. But it's still hard. It's more complicated because now they have to figure out, what is it that I value? What is it that I want? And even they have to think about their own home system. Like, is this a culture that I can live in? Is this a system that works for me? And a lot of my students are wrestling with that. And I've had a few, most of them plan to go back to China, but I have had a few who've already made the decision that, I don't want to go back there. I don't think that kind of political environment is where I want to spend the rest of my life.
So we have 2 minutes left, and I wanted to ask you what is next up for you and or for the family.
Yeah, I mean, we're here in southwestern Colorado. We're in a little town, so and I actually, I'm coaching now, so I'm like a track coach, and my daughters, helping my daughters do cross country and track. I do have a book project that I'm starting to work on, and I'm not really saying too much about it now, but it's something I've been thinking about for a while. So I've got something there. Leslie's figuring out projects as well. We expect to be here for a few years because our daughters are starting high school this month actually. So we always kind of wanted to be in the U.S. during those years.
想成为全球沟通达人吗？六度人工智能语音克隆技术帮你实现梦想。在这个新时代，语言障碍已成过去。我们隆重推出六度人工智能语音克隆系统，这项由欧美亚顶尖专家研发的突破性技术，让你可以克隆自己的声音，并将文字转换成145种语言和方言，提升你的个人和职业生活。想象一下，你可以在日本参加商务会议，在巴西上课，或与意大利的朋友畅聊，而这一切都用你自己的声音、他们的语言进行。操作简单，只需点击几下，无需复杂的科技知识，就能享受无缝衔接的体验，让世界向你敞开。从商务到教育，从媒体到娱乐，应用场景无处不在。企业可以更好地与全球客户建立联系，教育机构可以提供多语言学习，媒体可以创作更丰富的内容，触达更广泛的受众。今天就来体验这项革命性技术吧！访问，迈向你的声音无国界的未来。